Greetings, folks, and welcome to our first of four little talks on Wuthering Heights, which, for the record, is my favorite Victorian novel ever. One of my favorite novels ever. For this talk, I'm assuming that you've read to the end of Chapter 9. For the second talk, which I'll post in a couple of days, I'll assume you've read to the end of Chapter 17. Both of these chapters have natural breaks in the narrative, and the end of Chapter 17 will take you to about the halfway point. In terms of what I'd like to do today, a lot of it is basic introductory stuff, getting a sense of who the characters are, what the setting is, what themes seem to be in play, and how the overall structure that Bronte has set up here holds together. And of course, why our narrator, Lockwood, is an idiot. Let's start with the idiot thing. Lockwood is, of course, our primary narrator, and therefore the person through whom, or the voice through whom, we get all of the events of the novel. And yet, we see on a number of occasions, some of them quite funny, in the first couple of chapters, that he is not a good student of human nature. That is, he misreads people at least as often as he reads them correctly, I think. And he's prone to projecting his own interpretations and presumptions in ways that sometimes actually even need to be corrected by other characters in the novel. Let's take a look at the opening paragraph and see how that unfolds. I have just returned from a visit to my landlord, the solitary neighbor that I shall be troubled with. This is certainly a beautiful country. In all England, I do not believe that I could have fixed on a situation so completely removed from the stir of society. A perfect misanthropist's heaven, and Mr. Heathcliff and I are such a suitable pair to divide the desolation between us. A capital fellow. He little imagined how my heart warmed toward him when I beheld his black eyes withdraw so suspiciously under their brows as I rode up, and when his fingers sheltered themselves with a jealous resolution still further in his waistcoat as I announced my name. "Mr. Heathcliff," I said. A nod was the answer. "Mr. Lockwood, your new tenant, sir. I do myself the honor of calling you as soon as possible after my arrival, to express the hope that I have not inconvenienced you by my perseverance in soliciting the occupation of Thrushcross Grange. I heard yesterday you had had some thoughts—" "Thrushcross Grange is my own, sir," he interrupted, wincing. "I should not allow anyone to inconvenience me if I could hinder it. Walk in." The walk in was uttered with closed teeth and expressed the sentiment, "Go to the deuce," even as the gate over which he leaned manifested no sympathizing movement to the words, and I think the circumstance determined me to accept the invitation. I felt interested in a man who seemed more exaggeratedly reserved than myself. And okay, I read a little beyond the opening paragraph. It's quite frankly easy to get caught up. So let's see what just happened. Or in other words, what clues just got dropped as to how to read the novel that's about to follow. For one thing, we're faced with the apparent contradiction of a self-proclaimed misanthropist, wasting no time at all in hightailing it up to visit the nearest person to him as soon as he moves into the area. Now, I don't know about you, but if I don't want to see people, which I very rarely do, my preferred strategy is to not go near them. And yet Lockwood intrudes himself upon the household at Wuthering Heights not just once, but twice in as many days. So his understanding even of himself has to be taken with some skepticism. And this is the guy who tells us that Heathcliff is a capital fellow, not so much because he observes him as a capital fellow, but because he wants him to be a capital fellow, I think. Because if you take a look at the actions that Lockwood describes, the last thing in the world Heathcliff wants is anybody around. So we have this immediate juxtaposition of this narrator who fancies himself a misanthropist and a major character who actually is a misanthropist. But Lockwood's misreadings and social blunders continue, as we see in the next chapter and on the next day, and on his next visit when he practically pounds down the door to be let in, knowing he's not particularly wanted. When he finally is let in and he's in the company of Hareton and Catherine, whom we of course meet for the first time in this chapter, he's trying to make small talk and, noticing some animals, engages in the following exchange. "A beautiful animal," I commenced again. "Do you intend parting with the little ones, madam?" "They're not mine," said the amiable host, more repellingly than Heathcliff himself could have replied. "Ah, your favorites are among these," I continued, turning to an obscure cushion full of something like cats. "A strange choice of favorites," she observed scornfully. Unluckily, it was a heap of dead rabbits. And then shortly thereafter we find him talking with Heathcliff, who's now arrived, over tea, spouting basically conventional nonsense to a more or less hostile audience. "It is strange," I began in the interval of swallowing one cup of tea and receiving another, "it is strange how custom can mold our tastes and ideas. Many could not imagine the existence of happiness in a life of such complete exile from the world as you spend, Mr. Heathcliff, yet I'll venture to say that surrounded by your family and with your amiable lady as the presiding genius over your home and heart—" "My amiable lady," he interrupted, with an almost diabolical sneer on his face. "Where is she, my amiable lady?" "Mrs. Heathcliff, your wife, I mean." "Well, yes. Oh, you would intimate that her spirit has taken the post of ministering angel, and guards the fortunes of Wuthering Heights, even when her body is gone, is that it?" Perceiving myself in a blunder, I attempted to correct it. I might have seen there was too great a disparity between the ages of the parties to make it likely that they were man and wife. One was about 40, a period of mental vigor at which men seldom cherish the delusion of being married for love by girls. That dream is reserved for the solace of our declining years. The other did not look 17. Yet it flashed upon me, the clown at my elbow who is drinking his tea out of a basin and eating his bread with unwashed hands may be her husband, Heathcliff, Jr., of course. Here is the consequence of being buried alive. She has thrown herself away upon that boor from sheer ignorance that better individuals existed. A sad pity. I must be aware of how I cause her to regret her choice. The last reflection may seem conceited. It was not. My neighbor struck me as bordering on repulsive. I knew, through experience, that I was tolerably attractive. "Mrs. Heathcliff is my daughter-in-law," said Heathcliff, corroborating my surmise. He turned as he spoke, a peculiar look in her direction, a look of hatred, unless he has a most perverse set of facial muscles that will not, like those of other people, interpret the language of the soul. "Ah, certainly, I see now. You are the favored possession of the beneficent fairy," I remarked, turning to my neighbor. This was worse than before. The youth grew crimson and clenched his fists with every appearance of a meditated assault, but he seemed to recollect himself presently and smothered the storm in a brutal curse, muttered on my behalf, which, however, I took no care to notice. "Unhappy in your conjectures, sir," observed my host. "We neither of us have the privilege of owning your good fairy. Her mate is dead. I said she was my daughter-in-law, therefore she must have married my son. And this young man is not my son, assuredly." Heathcliff smiled again, as if it were rather too bold a jest to attribute paternity of that bear to him. "My name is Hareton Earnshaw," growled the other, "and I'd counsel you to respect it." So what do we see here? Well, we see Lockwood beginning mistaking dead rabbits for kitty cats, and then things going worse from there. There's, in fact, I think, no relationship that he identifies in the room at the time that he actually gets right, and yet he continues trying to project his own interpretations and sometimes his own narratives, for example, the good ministering fairy, onto a situation where they just don't belong. So there's this disjuncture between the facts as he encounters them and the narratives he imports and through which he tries to interpret them. They don't line up. And yet this is the guy telling us the story. So it leaves us necessarily wondering, I think, how much we can trust anything Lockwood says. He barges in where he's not wanted, misinterprets everything he sees, and then offers worse misinterpretations in the process of trying to recover from the previous misinterpretations that he's stumbled upon. And in the middle of this, there is this family of, in the context of the novel, real people, whose relationships just don't fit the conventional narrative. And here again, we've got this notion of how reality and narrative match up. And Lockwood seems to be a person whose thought is conditioned by narrative, and yet he's in this place where those narratives just don't apply. He's sort of outside the realm of where he actually understands, because of course, where our narratives break down is where our understanding breaks down. So Lockwood has bumped up against the limit of what he actually understands. He's venturing into the unknown in this isolated house in northern England. That is, there's a sense arising from his mistakes and from his awkward recoveries and further mistakes that whatever's going on here, it's not going to be what's expected. It's not going to be what he expects, and it's not going to be what we expect. So we're in many ways in Lockwood's position. We're flying blind. We don't know what to expect. Nothing is how it looks at first glance. There are deep and often hostile passions in play here that aren't even simmering beneath the surface, they're rippling across the surface. And it's these, not the story that Lockwood imports, that are going to form the narrative that he ends up recounting to us. In any case, I think it's probably time we move on to other questions of, I guess, understanding texts. And then we'll move on to some more specific character stuff. As for the various texts that make up the novel, it's actually kind of a mishmash. Of course, Lockwood's narrative incorporates the whole thing, and we just finished discussing the challenges with reading through Lockwood. But there are other texts contained in the story he tells, aren't there? For example, when he spends the night at Wuthering Heights, he encounters in the old sealed-off closet bed by the window a collection of books with Marginalia written in. And these are the books where basically Cathy has kept her diary. So that's another text we need to throw in here, another voice. And it's a voice from the past, from about 25 years prior. So the primary narrative begins in 1801. That's the date at the beginning of chapter 1. So we're thrust back to about 1776 here. And this is our first and really only encounter with Cathy's voice, because of course the story we have of her later is mediated through Nellie Dean, to whom I'll get in a minute. First, though, the Marginalia, even without looking at what it says, the way we encounter it is important. This is not a diary itself. This is somebody trying to write herself into the margins, literally, of someone else's narrative. It's a personal or subjective presence in a printed or objective or impersonal text. And to Lockwood, at least, the Marginalia is more real than the book in which it's written. This is profoundly romantic in the romanticism sense of the term. The legitimacy, the validity of knowing the world subjectively, of individual experience, as opposed to the objectivity of being strictly rational, or of anything we might call a master narrative, be it political or religious. Cathy is here in defiance of master narratives. And her very presence in the book then, and her presence in Lockwood's consciousness, is in itself a defiance of master narratives. We see Cathy here basically writing herself, making herself, in an environment that is, as we see later on, or even as we see from her diary entries, hostile to the point of being abusive. And that act of inscribing herself really illicitly is an act of self-assertion, a proclamation that she actually is there and that she is someone, in opposition to a number of other narratives that are imposed on her, as we'll see later on. That is very much as in Jane Eyre. We're in a world of inscription and over-inscription and contested narratives, of active questions of who and what a given person actually is, and who has the authority to define them, or even really sufficient knowledge to make the attempt. But in any case, it's in these marginalia that we get our first glimpse of the life of a generation ago, and the story that Nellie will soon be telling Lockwood by the hearth in Thrushcross Grange. And I think as well, the vision of Cathy and Heathcliff, the childhood vision of Cathy and Heathcliff that we get in those marginalia, is good confirmation for Nellie, because their conduct and the things about which Cathy writes is in broad agreement with the story that Nellie tells. That is, Nellie, although not flawless, is a more reliable narrator than Lockwood. So the guy who's actually telling the frame narrative, the guy who's telling the big story, is the least reliable of the various narrators that we have so far. Him, and then Nellie recounting the past, and Cathy in her own voice. And Nellie, of course, speaks as well as a participant. She's a fixture, very much like Joseph, to whom we'll get also in a few minutes. She comes with the place. She's not part of the family, but she's raised with the family. So the story that she tells is a story of people very close to her. It's not, as it is for Lockwood, a curiosity with which he diverts himself on a vacation really from his real life. So the amount that's invested in the narrative changes with who the narrator actually is. This is, of course, obvious, but it probably also should be said. But these, of course, aren't the only narratives. There's also the question of dreams. And dreams in Wuthering Heights are not just dreams. They connect to the world outside the dreamer's skull. This is, of course, part of the Gothic heritage that Bronte is drawing on really, really clearly. And it speaks as well to maybe the irrationality of much of the narrative, or also the sense that the story we're reading, the story we're encountering, taps into something that is rooted deeply in both the characters and in the land itself. Because, of course, in Lockwood's second dream, he dreams of Cathy, and he's not the only one. And the dream he dreams of Cathy is a dream Heathcliff also has. So these two separate dreams of the same character, these also are corroboration that the thing about which they're dreaming is real. So whereas, for example, in Jane Eyre, there are hints and traces of the supernatural, but we're never really in that world. It's on the fringes, and it may or may not actually be real. In Wuthering Heights, it's real. It's as real as the air, and it needs to be recognized as such. That is, we're not in the realm of the realistic novel in Wuthering Heights, as we are when we're reading Jane Eyre. In fact, and I'll have more to say about this in a subsequent talk, I don't even see Wuthering Heights as a novel at all, except just in the most formal sense. I think when we're in the world of Wuthering Heights, we're in a world whose depth touches the depth of myth, and I think we're in the world of myth. But as for the dreams, why don't we just take a look at a couple and see how they work, see what they reveal. Lockwood's second dream, the dream in which he encounters Cathy, goes something like this. This time I remembered I was lying in the oak closet, and I heard distinctly the gusty wind and the driving of the snow. I heard also the fir bough repeat its teasing sound, and ascribed it to the right cause. But it annoyed me so much that I resolved to silence it if possible, and, I thought, I rose and endeavored to unhasp the casement. The hook was soldered to the staple, a circumstance observed by me when awake, but forgotten. I must stop it, nevertheless, I muttered, knocking my knuckles through the glass, and stretching an arm out to seize the importunate branch, instead of which my fingers closed on the fingers of a little ice-cold hand. The intense horror of nightmare came over me. I tried to draw back my arm, but the hand clung to it, and a most melancholy voice sobbed, "Let me in, let me in." "Who are you?" I asked, struggling meanwhile to disengage myself. "Catherine Linton," it replied shiveringly. Why did I think Linton? I had read Earnshaw 20 times for Linton. "I'm come home. I lost my way on the moor." As it spoke, I discerned, obscurely, a child's face looking through the window. Terror made me cruel, and, finding it useless to attempt to shake the creature off, I pulled its wrist onto the broken pane and rubbed it to and fro till the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. Still it wailed, "Let me in," and maintained its tenacious grip, almost maddening me with fear. "How can I said at length. "Let me go if you want me to let you in." The fingers relaxed. I snatched mine through the hole, hurriedly piled the books up in a pyramid against it, and stopped my ears to exclude the lamentable prayer. I seemed to keep them closed above a quarter an hour, yet the instant I listened again, there was the doleful cry moaning on. "Begone!" I shouted. "I'll never let you in, not if you beg for 20 years. "It's 20 years, moaned the voice. 20 years. I've been a waif for 20 years. Thereat began a feeble scratching outside, and the pile of books moved as if thrust forward. I tried to jump up, but could not stir a limb, and so yelled aloud in a frenzy of fright. And of course it's with the yell that he wakes up. This, of course, is one of the most memorable scenes in the book, and the one around which Kate Bush based her wonderful 1977 song, Wuthering Heights, for which I've left a link on the slide. I'll probably put a link on the course page as well, just because it's such a wonderful song. The reason I include it here, though, of course, is to link the characters, particularly Cathy, to the landscape itself. That is, the landscape, the world of Wuthering Heights is not merely a physical world. It's a world that has a mythic resonance and that seems to occupy a position comparable to the position of the heavens, as comes out a little later on. The ghost of Cathy's been on the moors for 20 years. She's associated with the moors, and in the book that Lockwood has just read, or in the Marginalia rather, it's clear that the moors are where she and Heathcliff belong. They're creatures of the outside, for whom the constraints of civilization are a form of imprisonment, and in some ways a form of counterfeit. So that is, when we look at the various parts of the landscape and the concrete locations, we need to read them not just as even symbolic, but rather as a sort of a spiritual landscape. That is, an entire landscape imbued with a sort of a mythic resonance. This is especially apparent in Heathcliff's reaction when we realize that he's been having these dreams too. And he calls out, come in, he sobbed. "Cathy, do come. Oh, do, once more. Oh, my heart's darling, hear me this time. Catherine, at last." And in this little outburst, the two words that stand out most to me are "once more." Does this suggest that she's come in before? It certainly suggests that she's really out there, but has she come in before? And even the possibility suggests a permeability of boundaries between, we'll say, this world and the next, but also the moors, that is the outside, and the inside of Wuthering Heights, the living and the dead. A lot of boundaries that we seem to take for granted are challenged just by that notion that Cathy may have come back in once as a ghost, and the notion that she is out there. But of course, out there is exactly where she belongs. As I said, it was on the moors, it was to the moors that Heathcliff and Cathy went for solace with each other and from their abuse. And it's a location to which Cathy is drawn again and again, as is Heathcliff, and that Cathy in particular sees as where she really does belong. This comes out in the dream she recounts to Nellie, in which she dies and goes to heaven, but is thrown out of heaven and falls back to earth, not to hell, but landing on the moor, and cries for joy at being back where she belongs. I'll get to this in more detail when we discuss the scene in chapter 9 in which it's set, but for now, it's just enough to say that the resonance between the landscape and the characters, between the setting and the characters, is one that we really need to take into account when we're trying to understand and appreciate this book. But also, as I said, the dream presents the landscape as something worthy of being compared to heaven and being compared in its suitability for an end destination for a human being, a particular human being. That is, Cathy is a creature of the earth, and she belongs with the earth. And this holding up of the moor as a welcome alternative to heaven is another of the ways in which the book challenges the notion of master narratives and the particular master narratives that governed the culture in which Bronte herself was writing. It's also bound up with that facet of romanticism that was directed towards exploring the relationships of people and peoples with the lands they occupied and reading them on their own terms rather than in the terms of some imported ideology or some imported mythology, which can never have as organic a relationship with at least some characters as those autochthonous stories, those locally rooted tales and myths and associations can have. In terms of the novel's major characters, I think we can discuss them almost in a schematic fashion. This is a family story. It covers 3 generations, and I just want to talk about the first 2 generations right now. And there are 2 families involved with their relatively small circle of associates. We have the Earnshaws up at the Heights and the Lintons down at the Grange. These locations themselves are really quite different, aren't they? And between them, most of the narrative takes place. This is almost a claustrophobic narrative, and maybe for some readers that almost is unnecessary or even unwelcome. There's a sense, I think, in which Bronte has taken something that she may see as essential and removed it from the social world and just plunked it down in this isolated setting to see how it works. In that sense, there's sort of an air of distillation about the whole thing. She's exploring something that is, I think, in many ways deep and primal, at least in some of the characters, and doing it by way of stripping away all of the baggage, all of the interference that society often involves, and seeing what's left. And in doing so, she's approaching, I think, almost the way a painter might approach a scene. I don't even know if almost is an appropriate word here either. Think, for example, of the Earnshaws. What are the colors associated with the Earnshaws? They have brown hair, they're earth tones. Cathy and Hindley both, and they're robust, they're physically robust. There's an appropriateness of them to the place. You can picture them in your mind. They belong at the Heights. They belong in that stone house, in that stony landscape. There's a roughness to them and a directness to them that fits only awkwardly into the more refined constraints of civilization. Down at the Grange, on the other hand, the Lintons they're fair, aren't they? They're blonde, they have blue eyes, they have slight builds. They're not as robust, but they're the ones associated more with the comfortable culture of the England of the time. Mr. Linton Sr. is a magistrate. He is associated with the mechanisms of government. He is a respectable man of his period. Everything about him is associated with legitimacy and comfort and civilization. Notice that the Grange is walled in. It's in the middle of a park. It's an enclosed area. It's safe. It's contained. The Heights are up on the hills, exposed to the rough weather and not surrounded by a wall. There's a gate, sure, but there's not a wall you need to scale to get in. It's more open, it's more exposed. And the word I always use when I think of that location is it is a pretty primal location. Not as primal as the novel gets, because further up in the moors, there's Penistone Crags, which is the wild extreme in this gradient we're sort of on here. Whereas on the other end, down further from the Grange, there is the church and the village, but I'm thinking particularly of the church. That is, you can draw a line with the church at one end, Penistone Crags at the other, and at about the third marks, the Grange and the Heights, and there's the entire world of the novel right there. Put the line at a bit of a slope, and you've also got your elevation taken in. That is, the landscape, the setting of this novel is, as I've already said, I think, quite simplified, but not in the sense of being simplistic, but rather in the sense of being distilled. But as for the details of the families, well, let's see, how do we approach those? Mr. Earnshaw takes a trip to Liverpool on foot, and he asks his children, Hindley and Catherine, or sorry, I'll call her Cathy to keep the two Catherines distinct, Hindley and Cathy, what they want. And what they want also is quite revealing, isn't it? And particularly in Hindley's case, it's really tragic. Hindley wants a violin, and Cathy wants a whip. Let's talk about Cathy first. She wants a whip. Well, you know, you've read at least to the end of chapter 9 by now, and you can probably see the appropriateness of a whip for Cathy. She likes to have things her way. She likes to be in control, and there is an assertiveness about her that is quite compelling. Hindley, on the other hand, who becomes a monster well before the book reaches its halfway point, wants a violin. This is the picture of a sensitive young boy. When we meet him, he's obviously flawed. They're all flawed in some way. Perfect characters are boring. But there's a sensitivity to Hindley that's indicated in that desire for a violin or a fiddle that is just, when you think of what he comes to, heartbreaking. And as for the Linton children, it's easy to think of them as being sort of weak or insubstantial compared to the Earnshaws. And certainly Heathcliff describes them as being beneath contempt. But when we see them at home, they, of course, fight like children do, like siblings do. But there's nothing abnormal, really, about their behavior. But the lens through which we see them initially makes them look as if they're sort of a family of wimps. And perhaps compared to the Earnshaws, they are. But the Earnshaws aren't the norm. The Lintons are closer to the social norm. They're actually a very well-to-do, kind of normal family. But they're not our perspective characters, are they? The perspective we get once we shift into the historic narrative is the perspective of the Heights, by whose standards the comfort and civilization and certain amount of frivolity of Thrushcross Grange is weak and contemptible. Again, as always, we need to take into account the source of whatever information we're getting. But of course, it's not just the families who are in the narrative. There are two principal outsiders, Heathcliff and Francis, and these two are as schematically opposed to each other as the Lintons and the Earnshaws are. Where the Lintons are fair and slender, and the Earnshaws are earthy and robust, we have Heathcliff and Francis as respectively associated. If you want to again look at their palettes from a painterly point of view, Heathcliff's color is black and Francis's color is white. Heathcliff is dark complected, he has dark hair, dark eyes. Francis is pale and frail, and Heathcliff is robust. But the colors that both of them bring to the principal setting of the novel are colors that aren't already there. They both bring something from the outside, and what they bring is diametrically opposed. And it's not just a matter of color or physical robustness or lack thereof. Heathcliff is strong and hard and calculating and durable. Francis is sickly and mentally insubstantial. And here as well, I think I've suggested before that these characters look like human beings, but in a sense they're not. They're distillations of different facets of humanity, I think. Or at least that's one useful way that we can look at them. The other two principal characters are, of course, the servants, Joseph and Nellie, both of whom represent a certain type of religiosity, don't they? Joseph is the self-righteous, cranky, hypocritical, fire and brimstone evangelical, and Nellie's religiosity seems to be associated with the Church of England. One of the many ways that we can actually compare them, and again, this is fairly schematic, is to take a look at books. Joseph reads nothing but really the worst kind of religious polemic. And we find out that Nellie, in her capacity of looking after the Grange, has actually read quite widely among the books available to her. So Joseph is this narrow, bitter, cranky zealot, and Nellie is simply a civilized, well-read, intelligent Christian woman. Again, not without flaws, but on the whole a very sympathetic character. These, of course, are just brief sketches. I think what I'd like to do now is just move on to a slightly more detailed discussion of Heathcliff, and then perhaps that scene towards the end of chapter 9, with which the first quarter of the book roughly culminates. In many ways, this is, of course, a book about Heathcliff. He's the outsider, the interloper, the one who comes in and through whom so much ruin actually happens. There's much about him that is reminiscent of the folktale figure of the changeling. His name is the name of the eldest Earnshaw child who died, or I should say rather the name he is given, because presumably he had a name before Mr. Earnshaw found him wandering the streets of Liverpool. We just have no idea what that is. In fact, we have no idea what exactly Heathcliff is, except perhaps that he bears a very interesting connection to the landscape, very much as Cathy does. His name, Heathcliff, is a wonderful poetic evocation of the landscape, and his character and features are both hard and unforgiving. It's worth pointing out that in coming from Liverpool, a port city, Heathcliff could be from anywhere. We're told when he first arrives at the Earnshaw's house, he doesn't speak their language, so he is quite clearly foreign. And exactly how foreign he is, or what kind of foreign he is never settled. Sometimes he's referred to as perhaps being a gypsy, Bronte's word, but other possibilities are also floated over the course of the text. Is he connected to India? Or is he Turkish? Or is he connected to the New World, so-called? And there are a number of other possibilities as well. What we know about him really is that he's foreign, that he's dark, that is, he's a dark other, and that he came into the country via Liverpool, which was at the time the busiest port in Britain, bound up in the trade of both goods and human beings. That is, Liverpool was the port through which a great deal of wealth entered England and entered Britain as a result of the slave trade. So his origins are conspicuously unknown, racially ambiguous, and morally dubious. When he is first taken out of Mr. Earnshaw's coat, along with Hindley's broken fiddle, Nellie describes him repeatedly as an it. He's a thing. So when he first arrives, not only does he not speak English, and is he visually different from everyone around him, he is verbally a thing. So in every way, he is an outsider to the community of the Heights, or quite frankly, to community generally. And as for what his innate character is, what kind of person Heathcliff is or would be under ideal circumstances, we never know, do we? Because Hindley hates him from the get-go and makes his life miserable, especially after Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw die, and as a result kindles in him a profound hatred that is one of the two passions that defines his trajectory in the novel. The other one, of course, being his love for Cathy. But how much of that hatred, or how much of the malice that he brings into play, is a result of his ill nature, and how much of it is a result of his character being or having been destroyed by Hindley's abuse, is quite frankly an open question. Because we see him more than once consciously ruin the character of another person. So we know that Bronte recognizes characters can be ruined by the environments in which they find themselves. And there's that one scene where the drunken Hindley drops the baby Hareton, and without thinking, just on impulse, he sees this child falling and runs to catch it, and instinctively saves it, and then immediately regrets it once he has time to think about what he's done, because he just missed an opportunity to hurt Hindley. But I think it's important to bear in mind that that humane impulse is actually there at a pre-calculative level, and that gives, I think, some indication of the degree to which his character has been warped or destroyed even by Hindley's abuse. But of course, the most important relationship in the book is that between Heathcliff and Cathy. And I'll say a little bit about that now, and then try to get this edited and posted before the sun comes up. Of course, whatever else Wuthering Heights is, it's a love story. But it's not a conventional love story. I wouldn't waste my time teaching you one of those because they tend to be boring as fuck. But also, not only is it a love story, it's also in many ways a meditation on love, particularly on romantic love. And thrown into the mix at the same time, it's also a meditation on the tension between what we might call convention on the one hand and authenticity on the other. One place where all of these notions sort of cluster together is, of course, chapter 9, where Cathy's discussing Edgar's proposal and explicitly comparing him and Heathcliff in a conversation with Nellie that almost reads like a Platonic dialogue, in trying to either decide whether she's done the right thing in accepting Edgar's proposal or find a way to rationalize herself into thinking she has. Cathy draws Nellie into a conversation on the nature of love itself. The conversation turns into a comparison of her feelings for Edgar on the one hand, and her feelings, if I can use such a frivolous word, for Heathcliff on the other. I won't go into all of the details she gives for convincing herself that she loves Edgar. These are all fairly straightforward and, as Nellie points out, temporary and superficial. What I will do, however, is take a moment to reflect on the futility that emerges during that conversation of reasoning about love, of giving reasons for love. And while I said a moment ago that this whole exchange reminds me of a Platonic dialogue, it also, I think, in some ways undermines the whole notion of having a Platonic dialogue about something like love, because it appeals to the non-rational side of that particular feeling, experience, state of being, what have you. In being asked why she loves Edgar, Cathy gives fairly conventional responses and transparently superficial ones. But I think she also, in a sense, illustrates the futility of trying to give an account of why you love someone, at least in terms of accounting for that state of mind or state of being through lists of traits. And if I can be really subjective, one of the questions I absolutely hate more than any other being asked is, why do you love me? And this may make me sound like a bit of a monster, and maybe I am. My reasoning here is that you can spend hours listing attributes that a person has and listing them honestly without ever really getting any closer to the reason why you happen to love the person you're talking to. Because, of course, at least in theory, you could meet someone who has all of those attributes and then some, and not fall in love with that person. That is, I think, the conversation that Cathy and Nellie have here is a nice illustration of the insufficiency of rational discourse to account for certain facets of human experience. This, of course, was a popular notion among the Romantics, and one, quite frankly, that I wholeheartedly endorse. It's worth noting as well, I think, that when Cathy initiates that conversation, she's not trying to make up her mind about what to do. She's already made a decision and is trying to rationalize that decision. In this sense, she's not really trying to get at an answer, but to construct a rhetorical framework, I think, in which she can grant the answer she has come to some sort of legitimacy. And we do this all the time, don't we? We like to think that we consider our reasons and then make our decisions, but Bronte is very accurate here, and I think we all have to admit this if we're honest, that at least as often as not, we do things the way Cathy is doing them. We make a decision and then rationalize the decision and say that's the reason for the decision, rather than pondering step by step what we ought to do and then doing it. That is, when she initiates the conversation, she's not really engaged in an honest interrogation of ideas. She's engaged in trying to construct an apologetic. And specifically, it's her exposure to the more conventional world of Thrushcross Grange that has provided her the motive to behave in this way, which, of course, even she recognizes is profoundly dishonest, or if you prefer, inauthentic. And it's on that question of authenticity that I think I'd like to jump into the middle of the conversation, just where things shift to what Cathy actually thinks. We'll pick it up with Nellie. And now let us hear what you are unhappy about. Your brother will be pleased. The old lady and gentleman will not object, I think. You will escape from a disorderly and comfortless home into a wealthy, respectable one. And you love Edgar, and Edgar loves you. All seems smooth and easy. Where's the obstacle? Here, and here, replied Catherine, striking one hand on her forehead and the other on her breast. In whichever place the soul lives, in my soul and in my heart, I'm convinced I'm wrong. That's very strange. I cannot make it out. It's my secret, but if you will not mock me, I'll explain it. I can't do it distinctly, but I'll give you a feeling of how I feel. And here I think I'd like to pause just to flag the fact that Cathy is flagging a change in the discourse. She's just tried to give a rational account of loving Edgar, which was just really a thin rationalization. But then when she goes into an honest account of her love for Heathcliff, she is very clear that she can't say exactly what she means. There's a limitation on language itself. This seems to be part of the argument of the scene. She says, I can give you a feeling of how I feel. She can give an impression, but she can't show the actual thing. There's a limit to how much can be communicated, how much received. And it's in this uncertain, unclear realm of non-rational discourse, really, that she's able to approach the truth of her experience of love, as opposed to the neat and tidy package that a more rational approach would constrain her to present. All of which, I guess, is my very wordy way of getting around to recognizing that there are some facets of our experience that we are simply incapable of communicating. So now we'll pick it up again. She seated herself by me again. Her countenance grew sadder and graver, and her clasped hands trembled. "Nellie, do you ever dream queer dreams?" she said suddenly, after some minutes' reflection. "Yes, now and then," I answered. "And so do I. I've dreamed in my life dreams that have stayed with me ever after, and changed my ideas. They've gone through and through me, like wine through water, and altered the color of my mind. And this is one. I'm going to tell it, but take care not to smile at any part of it." "Oh, don't, Miss Catherine," I cried. "We're dismal enough without conjuring up ghosts and visions to perplex us. Come, come, be merry, and like yourself. Look at little Hareton. He's dreaming nothing dreary. How sweetly he smiles in his sleep. Yes, and how sweetly his father curses in his solitude. You remember him, I dare say, when he was just such another chubby thing, nearly as young and innocent. However, Nellie, I shall oblige you to listen. It's not long, and I've no power to be merry tonight." "I won't hear it, I won't hear it," I repeated hastily. I was superstitious about dreams then, and am still, and Catherine had an unusual gloom in her aspect that made me dread something from which I might shape a prophecy and foresee a fearful catastrophe. And again, I'd like to pause just to note a couple of little details. Catherine's getting into her understanding of how the mind works, of the relationship between our dreams and our waking consciousness. And for her, there is no hard line, there's no hard boundary between one and another compartment, I guess, in her psyche. And here again, I think she's right. I think many of the definitions we draw up so that we can have an intelligent discourse about something create the illusion that the boundaries, the definitions we use, are real in themselves. We treat them as real things. Cathy is taking a different approach. She is simply recognizing the interpenetrability, I guess, of different parts of our psyche. For her, it's all one field of experience. And as I find myself talking about this, constrained to speak my thoughts into a microphone as I've never been before, it occurs to me that this is a wonderful metaphor for Cathy's psyche as being aligned with the moors, of course, in the open where there are no rooms. And for Nellie, in her insistence on neat ideas, neat definitions, being the exact opposite, being a creature of a house, a person whose existence revolves around rooms and doors and easily navigable geographies, or at least layouts, or in other words, social constructs. And in this sense, I think it's very telling that when she tries to convince Cathy not to go down the road she's about to go down, she asks her to be more like herself. This brings us around to notions of identity and inscription, doesn't it? Nellie's trying to project onto Cathy a notion of who or what Cathy is, at the very moment when Cathy is trying to be her most honest about who and what she is. So there's a sense in which Nellie being bound up by conventions, by the neat definitions that belong indoors rather than outdoors, that belong in a house rather than on the moors, that she's incapable of fully apprehending what Cathy's about to impart, or even of apprehending what this person whom she's known for her entire life actually is. And on that we will press onward. She was vexed, but she did not proceed. Apparently taking up another subject, she recommenced in a short time. "If I were in heaven, Nellie, I should be extremely miserable. Because you're not fit to go there, I answered. All sinners would be miserable in heaven. But it's not for that. I dreamt once that I was there. I tell you, I won't hearken to your dreams, Miss Catherine. I'll go to bed, I interrupted again. She laughed and held me down, for I made a motion to leave my chair. This is nothing, cried she. I was only going to say that heaven did not seem to be my home, and I broke my heart with weeping to come back to earth. And the angels were so angry that they flung me out into the middle of the heath on the top of Wuthering Heights, where I woke sobbing for joy. That will do to explain my secret, as well as the other. I have no more business to marry Edgar Linton than I have to be in heaven, and if the wicked man in there had not brought Heathcliff so low, I shouldn't have thought of it. It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now, so he shall never know how I love him, and that not because he's handsome, Nelly, but because he's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same, and Linton's is as different as a moonbeam from lightning, or frost from fire. And of course it's during this part of the dialogue that Heathcliff, who's been listening all along, gets up and leaves, and therefore doesn't actually hear the second part, how Cathy actually feels about him. The conversation goes on with Cathy launching into a plan to use her marriage to Linton to elevate Heathcliff, the practical problems with which Nelly does not hesitate to inform her on. But then the conversation goes on again, and I'll read this last bit and then try to wrap up the talk. Because, as so often, I'm many hours behind when this actually should have been posted. My deepest apologies for that. I'm very sorry. Truth be told, I once again fell asleep under my laptop and woke up to an incomplete lecture at about 6 o'clock this morning. In any case, let's pick it up again with Cathy. But surely you and everybody have a notion that there is or should be an existence of yours beyond you. What were the use of my creation if I were entirely contained here? My great miseries in this world have been Heathcliff's miseries, and I watched and felt each from the beginning. My great thought in living is himself. If all else perish and he remain, I should still continue to be. And if all else remained and he were annihilated, the universe would turn to a mighty stranger. I should not seem a part of it. My love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it, I'm well aware, as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. Nelly, I am Heathcliff. He's always in my mind, not as a pleasure any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being. So don't talk of our separation again. It is impracticable, and—" She paused and hid her face in the folds of my gown, but I jerked it forcibly away. I was out of patience with her folly. "If I can make any sense of your nonsense, miss," I said, "it only goes to convince me that you are ignorant of the duties you undertake in marrying, or else that you are a wicked, unprincipled girl. But trouble me with no more secrets. I'll not promise to keep them." And man, there is just so much there, isn't there? Honestly, there are places where I can't read that without my throat constricting. But let's see what's actually up. I mentioned before that this conversation reminds me very much of a Platonic dialogue. Actually, it reminds me of a very specific Platonic dialogue, the symposium. As for what the symposium is, it's a conversation held at night over copious amounts of wine on the nature of love, in which each of the speakers presents his idea, it's all dudes, of what love actually is. One of these is the comic poet Aristophanes, who presents the idea of love as a reuniting with one's missing opposite half. He presents a myth in which, at one point, human beings were much bigger than we are now. We had 4 legs and 4 arms and faces looking in both directions. And because we were so powerful, we attempted to take over Mount Olympus, and in his fury at our audacity in challenging the authority of the divine, Zeus split us in half, So each of us now is wandering around the world looking for literally our other half, our completion, or if you prefer, our soulmate. And to be clear, in Aristophanes' vision, these halves are not specifically gendered. They can be male-female, male-male, female-female, doesn't matter. But in any case, I think this dialogue really kind of is a wonderful example of Aristophanes' theory of love, as presented in Plato's Symposium. Because this is tragic, isn't it? It seems nice. We speak about soulmates. We speak about finding the one person that completes us. But in a world of billions of people, what do you do if you're born, say, in Canada, and your other half is born in, Sri Lanka, and you never meet? That is, this vision put forward, this really nice, rosy-sounding vision put forward by Plato's depiction of the comic poet Aristophanes, is one of the saddest things I can imagine. But it seems, if we want to take that logic forward, what might even be worse is if the two halves actually do meet, as Catherine and Heathcliff do, even though they are, in fact, born in very distant parts of the world. As I said, we don't even know where Heathcliff is from. But when they are united, they, of course, form their own sort of solipsistic world, don't they? Cathy's declaration that if the rest of the universe were to be obliterated but Heathcliff remain, her world would still be intact, is a really good illustration of this. They don't care about anything outside of themselves because they don't need anything outside of themselves. That is solipsism. But it, in some ways, also is a depiction of the most intense romantic loving relationship imaginable, this complete absorption and identification with the other. And this is one of the other elements of love that I really want to explore here. And here Cathy gets into it in some really interesting ways, that to love a person is to identify completely with that person. As she says in her own words, he's more myself than I am, or later on, I am Heathcliff. So in the space of 2 pages, she identifies both of them as identifying completely with the other. And this is, I think, part of the appeal of the novel is that closeness, that complete identification with the beloved is, I hesitate to use such a namby-pamby word as appealing. It's compelling. It's something many people spend their entire lives looking for. And when Cathy starts talking about the seeming need for there to be something beyond one's immediate contained self, it looks like she's launching into some sort of religious argument, doesn't it? But as we saw with heaven, Cathy doesn't belong in that thought world. And for her, the thing that justifies her existence, that gives it meaning, is not some transcendent state, but this person with whom she identifies completely. Cathy's interests are not heavenly or infernal. They are earthly. They are of this world. And her description of the experience of love is also of this world. This is, on the one hand, cloaked at times in supernatural imagery, but this is a profoundly human experience that she's describing. And she's avoiding or even rejecting the temptation to attribute to it something either heavenly or diabolical. And here again, we see the difficulty of honest communication of one's actual state, of one's authentic being, in the context of a culture that insists on inscribing over one an approved set of narratives, of values, of standards, as Nellie tries to do with Cathy. When Cathy says she doesn't belong in heaven, Nellie's oh-so-pious response is, well, that's because you're a sinner. Well, fuck you, Nellie, and the Bible you wrote in on. I'm generally sympathetic to Nellie, but in this moment, I really want to fucking choke her, because she is piously refusing to hear, or to see, rather, what is plainly in front of her face. And here again, to go back to what I was discussing with you a few slides ago, the question of cultural authority is central here as well, isn't it? And this is something with which the Romantics were very concerned. Cathy is speaking from a position of absolute certainty about who and what she is, and of absolute rootedness in the place where she is, to the point where such abstract notions as heaven and hell just have no place in her thought world. They're figments. Well, not figments, but intrusions, things that have nothing to do with her. As she says, heaven is not her home. The heath is. And in that sense, she is exactly where she belongs, but because she's been corrupted by the influence of Thrushcross Grange, by the influence of society, she loses that. And Nellie is, because of her own categories of thought that she carries around in her head, incapable of seeing, of hearing, and of empathizing with what Cathy Earnshaw actually is. And I think that will about do it for today. I've gone on a little longer than I intended to. I see now that I've edited all those sound clips and the talk is still well over an hour. So I hope you find it useful. I hope you enjoy it, or enjoyed it rather. I guess it'll be past tense for you by the time you get to the point where I'm talking now. Anyways, I will have another talk posted by probably sometime late in the evening on Thursday that assumes that you've read up to the end of chapter 17, which I figure by this point in the week you probably got to already anyways. So until then, thanks very much for listening, and I do very much look forward to talking with you about this wonderful book on Friday. Bye for now.